today's lecture is going to be a little bit about troubleshooting a sealed system, and we're gonna go through some of the steps that you would do when you have a refrigerator that's not cooling. Yesterday, one of the refrigerators here at the school, someone had told me from another building saying that the refrigerator's not cooling, and I sent some students over to check it out, and we brought it over here to take a look at it. One of the first things that they did is they opened up the unit and they checked the freezer, and it was completely warm. It wasn't cooling at all. So he saw that the fan in the freezer is working. What type of condenser is this, guys? Do you know what it's called? What happens when it gets real cold and you walk across a bare carpet, you know, and you touch somebody?
Oh, static.
It's called a static condenser, static electricity, but it's called a static condenser. And a static condenser is a condenser that does not have a fan to cool it down. Most refrigerators, this condenser's folded up into a smaller compartment down in the bottom next to the compressor here, and it has a fan that helps cool it down. This one is called a static condenser, so there is no fan on the back of this refrigerator. So the only two components that are really running when it's cooling is the fan in the freezer and the compressor. So while they were checking it out, they saw the fan in the freezer was running and the unit was completely warm. They touched the compressor was hot, or at least warm. Like didn't know whether it was working or not, but they knew that the compressor was warm. So whenever we check a refrigerator for not cooling, we don't always want to go to checking sealed system. If you go into a customer's home, doing a sealed system job is the last thing you want to do. You want to check everything electrically. You want to make sure the compressor's running, the fan's running, and everything is doing its job. And once you've exhausted all the electrical problems, we want to go to sealed system. Okay? So when we went to this unit, we saw that compressor was warm. I said, let's check the relay and overload to make sure they're good, and ohm out the windings in the compressor. But one of the first things I wanted him to check was what? Do you remember what was the first thing I told you to check?
Voltage.
Voltage to what?
To the compressor itself.
Voltage to the compressor. So, you know, I want to know, okay, the fan's running, but is the compressor getting power? And he was getting 120 volts. So that means electrically the timer and the thermostat, or even if it was a computer board, if I have power down there, my problem is not electrical as far as like the controls. My problem could still be a bad compressor, but it's something I have to work out and diagnose. So once I checked out the windings and everything else, put everything back on, we plugged it in, it felt like the compressor was running. The next thing we did is, what did we do after we saw that the compressor was running? What other things did we physically look for that we didn't put a meter on to test it?
Without a meter?
Yeah.
Leaks within.
No, before we even checked for leaks. What did you do that said, hey, something's not right? You felt the compressor was warm, but what else did, I always tell you guys, when you're working on a system, I want you to use your hands and feel. What are we feeling for?
What temperature?
Temperature on what?
Temperature on the suction line or on the
condenser.
the condenser.
That's the first thing you're gonna see. The suction line, yeah, you can do it, but a lot of times suction line coming off the evaporator in the freezer is almost gonna be like room temperature.
Okay.
Okay? You don't want it too cold. If the suction line's too cold, it'll start sweating. That's why they put this insulation around it, this insulation here. Because if it gets too cold, just like when you get a cold drink with ice water and you set it down and the outside of the glass is so wet and it leaves water on the table, condensation or humidity in the air, once it gets too cold, condenses and then it'll drip water. So we don't want that suction line that cold. So really what we want to feel is this line coming right off the compressor. What do we call that line in the compressor?
Discharge.
It's called a discharge line. And it should be about 20 degrees higher than ambient temperature. So we want to see, you know, at least 90, 100, 120 degrees, 120 a little high, but 90 to 100 degrees coming on this discharge line. And we felt it felt like room temperature. Now, does that mean that we have a good or bad compressor? It is very possible that the compressor is still bad, because if the compressor was electrically running, a compressor is two parts. Compressor has the electrical motor, like a dryer motor. It's what makes the compressor run, but then we have a physical piston inside of there that causes compression of the gas, and that's what pumps the gas around. So you could have a relay overload and the windings of a compressor all check good. Does not mean the compressor is good. Example, a water pump and a washing machine. You can measure the windings on a water pump and have good resistance. You could have voltage to the pump. It could be something broken inside, or a sock caught inside. Or even once I brought in a pump that the impeller was all chewed up. And the pump was running, but it was not pumping. Compressors have that problem as well. The linear compressors on LG, they put the valves on the top of the piston and not above the piston like a car engine, like a head. And the valves go bad, they get damaged. And so what we have, what we call an inefficient compressor, a compressor that's running, but it's not able to pump, because in a compressor, it has to have a way to separate the suction from coming in to the discharge coming out, so we can create uneven pressure. So what we want to do is put high pressure here, low pressure there. High pressure, high heat. Low pressure in the system, low heat. So therefore, we want that difference in pressure. So we have to do that. So when we ran this unit, we determined the compressor was running, and we said, okay, let's see what kind of pressures we have in here. So we did do some work on this, but I sort of duplicated what we were going to do to this unit. And if you look closely on this, can you zoom in on that? If you look closely on this gauge, I'm going to take this tape off for a second. The needle's at 0. And when he connected the gauges to this system, it read just about 0 PSI. And I was talking with the student that was working on it, and I said, 0 PSI, does that mean there's no refrigerant in the system? And most of the time people say, yeah, if it's 0, it's empty. There's nothing in there. Because if I put Freon in, what would it normally do? It would raise the pressures up. What are the pressures of a refrigerant system like with 134A? Usually when it's off, what do you think the pressure should be?
It's like 70 PSI.
Between 60 and 70. And one thing about
60 and 70.
134A, looking at the temperature pressure chart, the 134A at 70 degrees is about 70 PSI. Its temperature and pressure are about the same. So we put it on there, if you could see that this gauge was reading just about 0. Okay? So that would be an indication that the refrigerant has escaped, or we had a leak within the system. Or, in order to check pressures, he had to add an access valve. Adding a temporary access valve like this, some of them called bullet valves, this clamps onto the pipe, and then after it clamps on the pipe, you have to use a tool that will pierce a hole through the pipe in order for it to access. I have seen students put these valves on, but never accurately pass through the tube, and they're here and they're not checking pressures. Okay, now on this valve, there's a little core inside of there. They call it a valve core. And on this hose, and I know you're not going to get that on camera, there's a little piece of metal inside this hose that presses down on it. I've had students that had this hose installed the other way around. Put this one here and that one there. Well, the difference on this hose here is there's no depressor for the core. I've had people put this on here, and look, if I put this on, nothing happens. If I switch the hose and put this one on, as soon as I put it on, it starts leaking out whatever little pressure that's left in there. So I've had students put the hose on backwards, and they ran the vacuum pump to pull a vacuum to charge it, ran the vacuum pump for 20 minutes, got 500 microns, and then put the Freon and started charging it with Freon. And they're like, Richard, I can only get 2 ounces in. They're supposed to take 4 ounces. It's not taking the Freon. And I'm running the compressor. If you got 2 ounces in there, even though it's undercharged, you should still feel heat. Okay? But the problem is that since they had the hose backwards, when they pulled the vacuum, they only evacuated the hose and never really evacuated the system. When they let the charge in, the hose was the only thing that held the charge. The charge didn't go in the system. So you gotta make sure you have the hose on it correctly. So, anyways, we connected the valve on here, and I'm gonna bring the gauges down to the bottom here. And when you're using these gauges, one second, get it threaded here. When we're using these refrigerant gauges, when you want to test pressures in your system, you do not want to open the valve. Opening the valve has nothing to do with this hose and this gauge. They are directly connected. As soon as you attach the hose to the system, your gauge is going to give you a pressure reading, if there's Freon in it and your valve's connected properly. The only time we open the gauge is if I wanted Freon to come out, I wanted to pull a vacuum on the system, I wanted to recover on the system, I would put the hose to my machine. Opening the valve is in between these two here. And opening and closing the valve is only allow the Freon out or Freon in or vacuum or whatever. That's when we open the gauge. We do not open the gauge just to check the pressure on the system. Okay? So anyways, the question I asked earlier was that 0, does that mean there's nothing in the system? So what, does that mean it's empty?
Yes.
No.
Not totally.
No, Papa.
When you guys learn refrigeration, you learn about PSIG, pounds per square inch gauge pressure. And basically what that is this is a gauge, and it's reading the pressure inside the system. And the pressure of 0, in most numerical, mathematical things, 0 means absolute nothing. It means nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But what 0 in refrigeration system means that whatever's inside the system, the pressure inside this system is equal to the pressure outside the system. Because this gauge is what we call a compound gauge. We have 0 going up with positive pressures, but we also have 0 going down. It's not considered PSIG. It's not gauge pressure. It's inches of mercury vacuum from 0 to 30 inches vacuum. If I'm on a 30-inch vacuum, that is equal to absolute nothing in the system. So we run a vacuum pump. This gauge goes from 0 down to 30. That means everything in here has been sucked out, and the pressure in here is lower than the pressure outside. So that's what 0 means. 0 means there's still something in there. It could be air, it could be Freon, but the pressure inside the system is not higher than the pressure outside. So 0 means it's equal to the pressure outside. Okay, we call that atmospheric pressure. At sea level here in Florida, we're at sea level. I mean, it rains, we're already underwater. Sea level is 14.7 PSIA, pounds per square inch atmospheric. So at 0 on our gauge, we have 14.7 PSIA, actual 14.7 pounds of pressure. Okay? So if you're reading 50 on here, the actual pressure is 50 plus 15, or 14.7. Does that make sense? So when we're reading gauge pressure, we just want to know the pressure inside the system. We don't want to know the pressure inside the system different from the pressure outside the system. All right? So that's what that means. So going back to this unit, then what we did is we went ahead and we put a gauge and it said 0. But it goes back to one of the first things we did. What was the first thing we thought was wrong with the unit? The compressor. So we still wanted to know if the compressor was running and working. I don't care if it's at 0. When the compressor runs, this insulation here has our heat exchanger, which is our capillary tube and our suction line, and a condenser is our discharge. The compressor is going to suck from the suction and pump out to the discharge and pull this down to 0 normal running pressures when it's running. When it's off, is again, we're supposed to be at about 60 to 70. But if I'm low on freon or loss, what would happen is this would pull down into a vacuum. So let's get my power here. Now, if I take this refrigerator and plug it in, at 0 PSI, what we're gonna look for is we're gonna look for it to pull down into a vacuum because we don't have sufficient pressure in the system. If it pulls down into a vacuum, that's an indication. If we can pull the tape off here, if you guys can see that the needle's now starting to revert back down towards 30. Okay? And to me, immediately, I know the compressor and the pump is running. I don't have enough gas in my system. But we still have to have some other tests made. One of them would be, how do I know it's a leak and not a restriction? Well, when it's off, pressures are both supposed to be 60. If I had the high side hose connected and connected to the high side of the system, I'd have 60 on both when it's off. I only had 0 on the low side. I could have had one of 2 problems. If I had a restriction, what does a restriction actually mean? What does that mean?
You might have some material.
Well, what is a restriction though? Not what caused the restriction, but what, if I told you this system has a restriction, what am I really talking about?
Meaning that the refrigerator is not really cycling through properly.
There's a blockage of some sort.
Yes, like the compressor pumps into here, it comes back down, and it comes out of here into a dryer filter. It goes to our capillary tube here, and that capillary tube goes to the evaporator and a suction line coming back down. A restriction can be anywhere within that system. Okay? Restriction would be like you went to a doctor and they said, oh man, your arteries are clogged with cholesterol, and that like your heart can't pump the blood properly through your system. Well, this is just like the heart. This is pumping the freon through the system. Everything else in this refrigeration system is nothing more than pipes. It's nothing but tubes. A tube in, a tube out, and a tube in. And a compressor is the only functional moving part in a basic refrigeration system. Now, if we go to one that has 2 evaporators in the upper and lower half, now we add other components, but we're not talking about that today. So anyways, okay, we're at 0. I saw it pull down to 30, but where is my needle now? What is it saying now?
I feel like you're basically at 0.
I'm at 0. If I had a restriction, one thing is compressors can't normally equalize the pressure. And what I mean by that is the compressor is pumping freon into the condenser, and when I turn the refrigerator off, the compressor has pumped all the freon to one side, but sucked all the freon on the other side. So they were here equal. Now the compressor pulled from one side and pushed to the other. If I had a restriction, compressors really don't have the capability of allowing the pressure to go back and equal into the other side through the compressor. The only way it would equalize is going through the evaporator and coming through this capillary tube back to the compressor on the low side. Okay? So the separation is done by the compressor. But when it went to 30-inch vacuum and went back to 0, what would that indicate to me?
That there is freon.
It evened out, but a little bit more. If there was a restriction, restrictions usually happen at the dryer filter and the capillary tube. 99% of your time, this is right where your restriction is going to be. Not only that, It might be this one portion where the dryer filter and the capillary tube meet. Because usually restrictions in a system are oil from the compressor, got pumped through the system, condenser gets cooled down, that oil was in vapor form as it's flowing, but if I cool it down, remove the heat, it starts clogging back up. It can block up my capillary tube here and cause a big problem. So if the capillary tube was restricted, this would pull down to a vacuum and sometimes not go back up to zero. It pumped everything to the condenser, but the restriction prevented it from coming back to the low side of the system. But that still isn't 100% proof that I have no restriction. So the next thing we want to do is we want to determine, do I have a leak or do I have restriction? And there's one other test can be made. Can you pause the video for a second? Okay, so if I thought that it was low and I might have had a restriction, I still want to know, do I have a restriction or do I have a leak? Well, right now, this pressure went down into a vacuum when I plugged it in. And it's cooling down into a vacuum. So one of the things I do is I'll take some Freon and I'm just gonna crack this hose here. Now this hose is on backwards too, but it's not gonna hurt it. I purged it to get the air out. Now I'm gonna start adding Freon into the system. Two things I wanna do. I wanna start feeling my condenser line, which immediately right now I can feel it heating up. Any of you guys wanna check this out? Just go ahead and touch this discharge line right here. Come check it out. You feel heat being produced? You feel the heat coming off? Okay, so I didn't fully charge it, but I added enough Freon. What I want to do is I want to see if I can get it out of a vacuum. If I see it pull back down to a 30-inch vacuum right now, I left it open for a little bit. I did not measure the charge in. But what I want to do is I want to feel, oh wow, these loops now, I can start to feel heat coming down to about here, where here it's starting to get cold, like room temperature. So my condenser is half full right now, okay? If I had a restriction, and it was my capillary tube, okay, as I add Freon, you're still gonna feel this heat. You're still gonna feel this heat initially. But once it pumps all the Freon into the condenser and it's restricted, it cannot flow back around now. It pumped all into here, the condenser becomes like this Freon tank. It just holds the Freon. If you grab this tank right now, this tank is filled with 70 PSI of Freon. You say, well, heck, I don't even have 70 over here. You know, why isn't it hot? Well, once it's released the heat and we're not pumping through the evaporator or anything, it's not gonna be hot anymore. So if I felt this heat and the heat started going away, that's an indication I have a restriction. If you see now, I have this thing running at 0 PSI. Now, let me just double check. If I go to the freezer here, it's starting to cool. The refrigerator's cooling. But it was at 0. And if it was at 0, that means now we had a leak and not a restriction, okay? But we tapped into the system because we checked all the electrical and mechanical components that we could. We exhausted every other possibility before we went into the system to see what's going on. Now, the only thing we're trying to do is, do I have a leak or do I have a restriction? Now, when I unplug this unit, look at the Freon gauge here on the low side. What's happening now to the gauge? It's starting to rise back up, right? It rises back up because the system's doing what? We just said it a minute ago.
Equalize.
It's equalizing the pressures. If the unit was restricted, it'd be super, super slow equalization or no equalization. Then I would know, hey, I got a restriction in the system, and I'm gonna start here at my dryer filter and check to see if I'm restricted right here, okay? So this thing went back up, we're good to go. Now I want to know if I have a leak. We have many ways to test for leaks. I'm going to go ahead and just take this tank off. We'll get it out of the way for now. So, where's all my goodies? All my toys? Right here. The first method of leak detection is going to be your leak detector. But before we apply a leak detector, we want to visually inspect the system. What am I looking for? Does anybody have any idea what I would be looking for if I thought my system was leaking Freon?
Can you hear it?
No, I'm looking, visual.
A crack somewhere, maybe?
Bubble.
Or a
What'd you
stress?
say?
A crack somewhere, or it look like a stress in the metal?
Yeah, but you're not really gonna see most leaks, but what'd you say? Did you say something?
No.
Okay, so I said with Freon, what also flows around the system? I said it could cause you restriction. What was it? It's in the bottom of the compressor?
The oil?
The oil. If a system has a leak, especially on the high side, there usually is evidence of oil that leaked out with the Freon from one of your brazed joints, or even if the pipe is corroded and bad. Okay? So now the question is, where's my leak? I'm at about 60 PSI and the compressor's off. So one of the first things we want to do is we want to check all the brazed joints themselves to see if they're leaking. So we would take our soap solution, we got a little brush here, and we're just going to apply it to our brazed joints here. And I'm also going to put it on the valve that we just added to make sure that our valve that we added was not leaking. Okay, because we did put pressure on it, and I did take a picture, I'll put it on the video, of what the needle looked like after we pressurized it. We marked where the needle was, and in 24 hours it dropped 10 to 15 PSI. So what we would be looking is for small, minute bubbles coming off of any one of these brace joints, which we didn't see anything. And it doesn't always have to be a brace joint, but they're usually the most obvious things we would look for when we're looking for a leak. The leak could be anywhere in the system. And one of the bad things is coming out of this condenser, it runs into this line that goes up into the refrigerator here, and it comes back out over here. What is that line called? Anybody know?
The line that's going into
A
the
Yoder
Yeah,
loop
that
or a
works.
hot gas loop. And what happens is that refrigerant, that line runs around the door of the freezer. And they use the heat of the condenser to make where the gasket on the door meets the refrigerator. And that heat helps keep the refrigerator from sweating. Remember I said, when the humidity in the air, when it reaches something cold, it sweats. Refrigerators will sweat and cause water leakage if there's a problem with not enough heat. So that condenser, back in the day, they used to use electric heating elements inside those walls to keep it from freezing around the door. The government said, listen, you gotta stop making, or you gotta start making refrigerators or other appliances more energy efficient. So the manufacturers removed the electric heaters and put a refrigerant line in the wall instead and used the Freon to warm up the wall. Now, that line runs inside the wall of the refrigerator. You cannot leak check it with liquid detection. Really, you can't get inside the wall at all. So what we have to do is we have to check all of a system that we can that is exposed. Our condenser, our compressor, and the evaporator inside the freezer. You'd have to take the cover off and do that. Now, going to the evaporator, whenever you are running a refrigerant system, do not take the cover off of the evaporator, the freezer cover, and check pressures. Because we need the airflow over the tubing in the freezer to apply heat to the evaporator. If we don't have a cover over the evaporator, our pressures will not be accurate. If you're doing a job on a system and you find out that you have to service it, I've had people call me and said, yeah, I changed the compressor and I'm not getting the right pressures. I'm getting like 10, 15 PSI, but I weighed in the exact amount of Freon. My first question is, do you have the cover over the evaporator? I had a question from someone today who called me on that. And one of my top techs called me the other day on it, and I asked him, do you have the cover of the evaporator? Oh, yeah, I do. He told me like a minute later, said, oh, no, I forgot the cover's not on. Well, you cannot check the pressures on the system unless the covers are accurately air flowing over the coils. Because the heat of the air going over the evaporator is how the Freon evaporates. That's why we call it evaporator. Comes in the evaporator as a liquid, and that hot air causes that Freon to turn to vapor so it can come back to the compressor. So you cannot check pressures after that. Okay, so I soak tested and we didn't find any leaks here. I know there's more things I could check, but I do want to check this line right here. I feel this line has a lot of like corrosion on it. It's not smooth. It's supposed to be black and painted like this because it's steel, and actually the paint helps keep the steel from corroding. But this refrigerator is quite old. I'm just gonna take, for the heck of it, and just run it across my line here. And just to see if I see it. Now you wanna put it on generously. Right, yeah, I made a mess on the floor, so in the customer's house, you wanna put some down on the floor here or whatever. And you do wanna wipe this stuff off because some of these soap detectors are corrosive. You can use this same thing when you're checking your gas stove or dryer, like if it has a gas leak, like natural propane gas. But don't let it drip onto the panel of the stove and leave it there. It'll cause a corrosion and discoloration of the metal. You want to clean it up right away, get it off. Okay, so I still don't see anything leaking here. I don't see any bubbles. It could have been from here. It could be anywhere. It's hard for me to find. But I want to look down here. Do I see anything that looks like oil? I don't see anything here. I'm feeling the line. Ooh, right here, this line feels extremely corroded. Come over here and test that line for me, please. So this line going up here to the condenser loop, I want you to just check this line from here all the way down to the bottom of this loop, right here where my finger is. Just generously tap it on there. Do not rub it. You want to tap it so that it just dabs onto the pipe. If you rub it, you make it too thin and it's not going to do its job. Okay? So go on the bottom of that loop too. Now the leak is not super big. It went down 10 PSI overnight, but that's a very, very slow leak. If I had a big leak, it'd almost be 0 by the next day. Okay? So liquid detector didn't help, right? So the next thing we want to do is try an electronic leak detector. And that's what we have here. Electronic leak detector has an on and off button, a reset. Reset is like if it detected like a leak of Freon, it'll start beeping faster as it finds a leak. The closer I get to the leak, it'll start going beep, 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 beep. When it finds a leak, it'll get louder, and I'll demonstrate that to you. And we got a sensitivity up and down. Higher the sensitivity is for smaller the leaks. But you don't want it to beep too fast, because if it beeps too fast, you'll never know the difference from when there was a leak and not a leak. Now the mute button is if you don't want the beeping noise, you just watch the lights, because if you didn't use the beeping, you can watch the lights as you find a leak. The lights will start to all light up. The more closer you are to the leak, the best leak you have, the more lights we're going to have here. So that's leak detection. So I'm going to turn it on. And that's what a leak would sound like at first. Notice the light was all on, but it went back off. So that's just a test to make sure the lights are working. And all we do is we're going to lower our sensitivity to the lowest sensitive thing we can do. Now this is very important that we don't let this tip get dirty. If it gets dirty, it'll register leaks all the time. And they do sell replacement tips. What I'm going to do is just go over here, and what you do is don't touch the pipe, especially now I got soap on it, but just go over where you think the leak is and just hold it there. If there's a leak, it'll start beeping faster like it did when I first turned it on. So I just go here, and I go slowly, and I do this. And I'm going to go check this line down here. the line goes into the wall there, so I can't go any further. And the line comes out of here, I'm gonna check it. I'm gonna check the suction line, capillary tube, and I can go through the whole condenser and the whole evaporator. But EPA questions talk about soap and electronic leak detector, and it says, when trying to find a leak and you're using an electronic leak detector, is that to pinpoint the leak or find the general area of the leak? What do you think the answer is? General area. And the one thing nice about this condenser being a static condenser, there's no fan back here. If you're checking a refrigerator and the refrigerator's running, then the fan will blow air and that Freon will be all over the place. I could be over here checking and it's gonna register Freon and I have no idea where it is. So if I went over here and it started beeping fast at this point, it doesn't mean the leak is right there. The leak could be here or here, just the Freon is floating into the area. And that's where we want to go back to our soap once we've got the area where we think our leak is, okay? So the electronic is just trying to get you close to the problem, and then the soap is going to break down the exact problem. Yes, sir?
To check the leak with this, we have to plug in the refrigerator.
No, because when it's running, what is the low side pressure? What was it when I charged it up? It was running at what? Zero. So that means the pressure on the low side, my evaporator and the suction line, is the same as the pressure outside. So if I run the compressor like that, it's not going to push Freon out as fast as I would like it. So that's a good question. That's why I have the nitrogen tank. I'll get to that in a minute. So I've charged this system when it's off. If this is 60, the high side is 60. I still have 60 PSI on both sides of the system. So another thing is if I find that I think that braze joint right here is leaking, for example, but my leak detector didn't quite detect it, we have this little clamp here. And I'm gonna get this on the camera here. This little clamp is got place for the pipe to go through. And let me grab a pipe. Hold on one second. So let's just say we have these two pipes that are brazed together, and we thought that this part of our pipe was leaking. So what we could do is this tool here clamps around that pipe. It doesn't close all the way, which is okay, but it has openings here, and it allows for us to take our electronic leak detector, stick it right in the opening here, and I'm actually inside of it, and so it concentrates if there's a leak just to my leak detector, so it doesn't go out in the air. So it makes the leak detector a little bit more sensitive and easier to identify if I have a leak in the system. So if I thought that one of my braze joints on here was leaking, I could clamp around the pipe. Even though I thought the pipe had a hole right there, I could take my leak detector, turn it on, set my sensitivity, and then stick it right in here. And if it was leaking, it would start beeping louder. So that would be a way for me to say, yeah, my leak is exactly right there. You wouldn't do it throughout the entire system, but if you wanted to try to pinpoint a little more with this, you could do it. Now what we used to do back in the day before we had all these fancy devices is we would take like a plastic bag or something, wrap it around the pipe, tape it on both sides and tape the seam and leave it there. We'd charge it with nitrogen and raise it up. If it was leaking from there, the plastic, if it was sealed up around the pipe and on the end, the bag would actually expand like a balloon, and you say, hey, that bag blew up. My leak is right there. So we would take a bag, let me get that. So we take like a plastic bag or something, and if I thought that my leak was right here, but I really couldn't find it, but I think this is where my leak is because of the corrosion, we'd wrap the bag around, and we wouldn't use that much. We'd wrap it around, and I would tape it real good here, and I'd run tape across the seam. If it was leaking from here, this bag would eventually fill up with the Freon, and it'd be like filling up a balloon, and it would indicate to me, hey, Freon's leaking out of the system, and that bag started blowing up like a balloon. So that's one method that we used to use back in the day before I had one of these clamps. Okay? So let's just say, hey, electronic leak detector, soap detection didn't find it. One of the things we want to do is the next thing is let's try to raise the pressure of our system more. Now this one's almost a fully charged system because it was running at good pressures, but normally you just use, EPA allows you to put a trace gas of refrigerant, like an ounce of R22 or something in the system, in this case 134. And then what we would do then with the compressor off, and this goes to your question, you know, do we do with the compressor running, is I'll hook up a nitrogen tank. And I would go like this, and then what I would do is I would add nitrogen to the system, not a fully charged system, but I add nitrogen to the system and try to get it to about 100 PSI. And by doing this, what's the advantage of doing this? Anybody got any idea? Adding nitrogen. What?
Purging.
No, not purging, but I want to use the nitrogen to raise the pressure to test for leaks. But what's the advantage of doing that? Why would we want to do that?
You don't waste refrigerant.
Make it easier to find the leak, it's gonna come out faster.
Yes, but if the compressor was running, it'd raise the high side to almost 120 PSI, 120, 125 PSI on a fully charged system. But when the compressor's running, the low side goes to 0. So yeah, the high side goes higher and I can run it and check for leaks on the high side, but if I'm on the low side, the max I can get is 60 PSI when the unit's not running. But by adding nitrogen, you can raise the pressure of the whole system to 100 PSI. And now we do our leak check again by raising the pressure. If the leak is very, very small, that added pressure might cause the leak to be a little bit higher and make it easier for the electronic leak detector to find it. Okay, so the reason why I only go to about 100, I got it at 110, is because the evaporator is made out of aluminum. And you have to look at the model and serial number plate. They usually have something called test pressure. And they said low side test pressure and high side test pressure. High side test pressure could be 250 PSI because this is made of steel. Low side test pressure may only be 125, 130. So we don't want to raise the whole system pressure more than the low side test pressure. Because when we add nitrogen, it's the whole system, not just the low side. Okay? So adding this, then I take my leak detector again, and then I'll go again. Do I have any leaks? And I go very slowly, just move a little bit and then sit there. Don't move too fast. Because if your leak's very, very small, the detector might not get it immediately. Now, if I had a leak, this is what would happen. Watch. So, depending on the leak, it would get larger and larger. Well, how come it didn't beep that fast is because I added nitrogen. So it's not just pure Freon coming out, it's Freon mixed with nitrogen. And that would not be as sensitive as it was just pure Freon. So this is what we would look for. And then if I saw beep, just like I heard a beep there, then I want to go back to my liquid and check it for a leak there. But let's just say, okay, I've done the soap, I couldn't find it. I've done the electronic, I couldn't find it. What do we do next? Pause the video for a second. Okay, so let's just say we tried our soap, we tried the electronic, and we just couldn't find the leak. We're in a customer's house 45 minutes already, we still can't find the leak. We don't know how big that leak is because when we show up to the home, it's already leaked out the refrigerant. It could have leaked out in one day. It could have been 6 months before it ever got to that point. Now the customer would probably tell you sooner than later, like not 6 months later, but let's just say it took 30 days for it to leak out to that point. But it cooled up to about like 3 or 4 days before they called you out. So you're like, man, you know, I mean, I can't find the leak. Well, what we did is we put 100 PSI of nitrogen, and I put a little piece of tape and put a mark where that needle was, and we came back again today and we saw that it had dropped, and I'll put that picture on the video. But you can't do that in a customer's house and just say, well, ma'am, I'm gonna charge this with nitrogen, I'm gonna mark it, I'll be back tomorrow to see how far it leaks. Well, the customer's sitting without a refrigerator for this point, and you really don't know, what if you come back tomorrow and it moved from 100 to 99? You don't know if that's just because it got colder inside the box, and because it's colder, the pressure dropped a little bit and that's normal, or it's slowly leaking out. So then we have this fluorescent dot. So what you would do at that point, if you are unable to determine the customer's leak, you only have one choice left if you've done electronic and you've done this. Now there is one other method of leak detection now we no longer use. It's called a halide torch. Halide torch was like a little MAP gas or propane bottle, and it had a little torch on the end where you'd light it and a flame would come off and it would be blue. And it had a little rubber hose, and you would take that hose like we did the electronic leak detector, and if it sucked Freon in, that Freon would get hit by the flame and burn, but it turned your flame from blue to green. You could still sort of use that, but you cannot, and listen to me, don't ever use a halide torch on a refrigerant like 600 or 290, okay? Because that contains propane gas in it, and it's flammable, and you're using a flame to leak detect, okay? So don't ever use a halide torch anymore. And even with these electronic ones, you have to have the newer ones that don't have like a spark, because if we're leaking, we want to make sure that we don't ignite that gas. So the next thing we want to do is we want to charge the customer's refrigerator back up. And usually what I tell the customer is like, man, listen, I know the system has a leak. I don't know how bad the leak is, how big or small it is, but I'm going to charge the refrigerator, and it was cooling. I don't know how long it's going to last. It could last a day, it could last a month, it could last a year before all that Freon leaked out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a little bit of fluorescent dye, and by adding that dye, if it's going to leak, we have this UV light tester here, this little UV light, and we go around the system like this, and if it's leaking, it's going to create a light green glow. Yeah, I'm sure, like, you ever been like to the skating rink or other places where they have the black light, or in a bar or something, a black light, and the white shirts are really bright, or the yellow's really, really bright. And this is basically what this stuff does. So you add some of this to the system, not a lot, but you add some of this to the system, it's a leak, it's gonna leak out. Now here's the bad thing about this stuff. You gotta use your hoses to pass this into the system. Your hoses and everything is going to get this yellow dye everywhere. So when we put it in the system, when we disconnect this hose, some pressure is going to be here and want to leak out. So when I come back tomorrow with my ultraviolet light, I might see that glow right here. So what I want to do is I'll take like my bag, I'm gonna make a small little hole in the bag, put it over the valve, and I'll probably make it smaller than that. Just over the valve like that. So when I disconnect my hose, if any of that dye is coming out when I disconnect the hose, it's not gonna get over all my pipes and everything. And not distract me. Because I don't want to see it unless I have the leak. Okay? Now remember, this is on your hoses and stuff, so the next refrigerator you do, you're gonna add a little dye that's left inside here into the system. It's not gonna hurt the system. Now this particular stick says 5 to 9.9 pounds. So this whole tube is designed to do a refrigerator or a sealed system like an air conditioner that holds 5 pounds of Freon. This is not designed for a residential refrigerator, but we could use it. So we gotta make sure that we don't put too much in there. I'm not gonna put this entire stuff in the system. I'm gonna put a little bit in, and that's it. So I'm gonna evacuate my system just like I would do when I normally charge it, pull a vacuum on the system to charge it, and then I'm gonna add this to our system. So I'm gonna put this on here. I'm just gonna let a few little bit drip into my hose. And I can see it bubbling up. And put this cap back on. I thought it would at least have something on there to keep it from leaking out. So I got enough in there. I don't need the hose, Vince.
Vince?
We'll have to clean this up after. So now that I got some of that dye in here, I'm gonna reconnect it to my Freon.
Did you want this one? This one have a low loss.
I don't need it now, it leaked all over the place. I gotta think. Just leave it right here for now. So now I'm going to just charge my refrigerant system. And I probably overcharged it by now, but. And what I would do is I would weigh in the charge and everything. I'm not going over charging the system, I'm just going over what you would do. So I added some of that dye into the hose, and then I had the Freon push it into the system now. So.
How did you add the dye to the hose?
Well, there's no valves or anything on here. I thought there would be, and when I took it off, it just poured out. So I connected to the hose and just held it upside down and let a few drops get in there. I don't need that much, okay? So, this made a mess everywhere. So anyways, now the system's running. I'm still low on charge, so in the customer's house, I'm gonna just charge it up like I would normally do. I'd weigh it in. I wouldn't just do it like I'm doing pressures. But I tell the customer, listen, you can use the refrigerator. Don't buy tons of meat or other perishables that, you know, if the refrigerator stops cooling overnight, that you're gonna lose hundreds of dollars of food. But I need to see how long it takes to leak out. So I'm gonna have the customer run it, and I'll call them back the next day. Hey, how's it going? Oh, it's still cooling, it's making ice, it's doing everything. Okay, I'm gonna wait 2 or 3 days and come back and see what the pressures are inside my system. Is it normal? I highly recommend you wear gloves when you're dealing with this
why.
crap.
Yeah, I see why.
So now I'm leaking.
Ah.
So anyways, once we put it in the system, I still gotta get it up to about 0 PSI on the low side, just so it's normal operation. Remember again, the system's running at 0 on the low side, so if I leaks on the low side, it's not going to be evident right away, but every time the compressor cycles off, it's gonna go up to 60. So if it's leaking, it's gonna keep leaking out that side. So then once we've done that, what we wanna do is we wanna take our UV light and just look at what this stuff looks like under the light. When I take it away and then I put it back, you see how it changes color? So what you wanna do now is you just wanna go, let me just break my bag off here, I don't take the hose off yet. Now I would've left that bag there and taken the hose off, I just wanna take it off now. And I just wanna go around and check all my system and just see anywhere in the system, do I see that glow? Okay? And so you would use a UV light like this to find the leak. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna charge this up, and it's charged up right now. And then we'll come back next week, because there's no school tomorrow, and we're going to go with the UV light. We'll test out the whole system to see if we can find the leak. Now, if this condenser is leaking, you can order the entire condenser and just replace the condenser. If just this pipe was leaking, I could cut this and bend it and bring it back to the compressor, or extend it with copper tubing. I can always replace a piece of pipe. I've even seen leaking right here, and so I cut it here and cut it here, and I just made my own pipe and soldered another pipe right back on. Now, it's not gonna look nice. We'd wanna replace the condenser if we could, but we can repair it if the leak is somewhere we could find and easily accessible. Now, here's the problem, going back to that Yoder loop. If that Yoder loop is what is leaking in the system, we cannot repair it, because these refrigerators, back in the old days, you could get to the entire inside of the system. The liner inside where you have your food is separated from the cabinet outside, and they have fiberglass insulation. You could take the whole inside of the cabinet out, and you can get to all the wiring and everything. But this is the 70s and 80s, okay? Not now. Nowadays, they have a plastic liner inside, a metal case on the outside, and they spray liquid foam in there and it expands and fills up all the voids. That's it. There's no way to get inside those walls except for cutting this refrigerator apart. But there is something we could do if we've come back after a week and saw that we lost Freon. It went back to 0 when it was off. And we used this dye, and nowhere in the system we could see that glowing like we saw here. Then we have to assume the only place our leak would be the yoder. But the yoder's not repairable. So I know Electrolux has it, I've installed it before. They have a hot gas tube repair kit. Okay, pause it for a second. Okay, so I don't know where someone's put it, but what the repair kit is it's basically, it's a kite string, and attached to the end of the kite string is a heating element that's like a long wire. Okay, I'll go online and I'll find a picture of it and add it to the video with a part number. And what happens is you would cut the pipe going into the yoder loop here, and you'd cut the pipe coming out of the yoder loop here, and you would just bypass it. You'd come off the condenser, go right into the dryer filter, and now we bypass the yoder. But the problem is if I don't have any Freon flow into that yoder, I don't have no heat. What did I say that the yoder does?
It keeps the door from
Sweating.
Sweating.
Dripping
Yeah,
water.
yeah.
So if you bypass it, the customer's gonna have water, and that's gonna be a problem, because it's gonna cause cabinet rusting, it's gonna cause the gaskets to get black with mold and everything, so we don't want that to happen either.
Right.
So this unit, you flush it out and clean it out, you hook a vacuum pump up to this side, and on the other side, you fish that little kite string in, and you let your vacuum pump run and suck that kite string through the yoder loop and pull it out the other side. Once you've got the kite string, which is long enough to pass through, the end of the kite string, and the kite string is probably about 10 feet long or 8 feet long. So it can pass through the entire system. Once it comes out, you slowly pull it here and you feed the wire through, and the wire is thin enough it can fit through. Sometimes it's harder than others to get it through. It's not as easy as it sounds. But once you pull it through, now you have an electric wire running through that yoder loop. You connect both ends of that wire to the power wire of your compressor, so whenever the compressor is running, that heater is on. And it's only on when the compressor is running. So yeah, but won't it sweat when the compressor is off? Well, let me ask you a question. The yoder loop only gets hot when the compressor is running. When the compressor's off, it's not hot anymore. So it doesn't, it's the same thing, but now we got an electric heater running through that system. So if our leak was the hot gas loop, we can use an electric heater to go through that loop so that we don't have to replace the refrigerator. I give you an example. I had a customer who had a Sub-Zero refrigerator built in. These refrigerators are $10,000, $15,000, but the yoder loop was bad. But it's in the wall, you can't replace it. So we could have run that heater kit through and saved the refrigerator from being replaced with this electric heater.
Wow.
So I'll try to find the one I got and show you guys physically. If not, I'm gonna go online and get the pictures of it.
Okay.
But we'd come back a couple of days after and we'd look for the fluorescent dye and see if we can repair it. If I cannot find the leak, then the only other choice is to bypass the yoder loop
To see if it.
and to see if that fixes the problem, because again, you have to test it for leaks. Any questions on this, guys?
No.
So this is how you would determine leak or restriction, and then how would you find the leak? What are the methods? So we had soap, electronic, and then we have the fluorescent dye.
Right.
Fluorescent dye is the last thing you want to do. Look at the mess I made.
Yeah.
I never used this one. I had another one that we used, and usually there's a part number. Frigidaire sells a dryer filter that has the dye built in. So when you repair the system, you put this filter on there, and that dye flows around the system, and we don't have to input it like that system
that's
does
cool.
there.
Only Frigidaire?
Well, I'm not saying only, it's the only one that I know of that actually has that dye built into its dryer filters. So that You could use a Frigidaire dryer filter on a Whirlpool, GE,
Right, that was
whatever.
my next question.
Just because it's
Yeah.
a Frigidaire, it's just a Frigidaire part number.
Like a
It's just a dryer
magnetron.
filter.
Like a magnetron.
As long as the holes
Yeah.
and everything are the same, you can put any magnetron in there.
Right.
The wattage may not be the same, whatever,
Right.
but a filter dryer physically, all it is they all do the same thing,
Yeah.
okay? It's just their size and where you would mount them, and if you're doing a warranty job, the manufacturer's only gonna pay you if you use their parts and not, use a
Absolutely.
Frigidaire and GE, so I ain't gonna pay you for a Frigidaire part.
And do you leave that filter dryer in there
Yes.
if you find a leak?
Yes,
Okay,
so if we put it on there, we leave it on there, and that's our unit,
okay.
okay? So any questions on this, guys? You can turn it on.